I'm not coming to hurt you. So we talked and we arrived at an understanding. But when a husband takes a second wife, there is always jealousy. That's very normal. At first I was jealous when she came to the house and I did little things, but that goes away. Whereas Hawa forced herself to accept her husband's decisions on relatively peaceful terms, my respondent Binta, a former accountant with a large multinational shipping company in Dakar, responded more angrily. She explained, "Among all things that are permitted, what God hates most is divorce. It really should be a last resort. My husband gave me signs that he would take a second wife. Before working for the TGV in France, he worked for the World Bank here in Dakar. So he was home often in the afternoons. He would eat, take a rest, go downtown to get things for the kids, and we would go out Friday nights. After we moved to this house, he increasingly lost this habit. One day, he was supposed to drop me off somewhere in the car, but when I went into the bedroom, he was lying down. He even put the covers over his body. And I said, 'I thought you were in a rush to go.' And he said, 'Oh yeah, I'm gonna get up soon.' And then I heard him say, 'Oh my God, can you sit down for a minute? I need to tell you something.' Instead of saying something like Subhana Allah, which I normally say, I said, 'Woi samande,' because I felt he would even say that maybe we would divorce. He said, 'I'm going to take a second wife.' We'd been married for 10 years. Nobody knew I was unhappy because he brought me twice to Mecca. The weekends we often went to Sally Portudal from Friday to Sunday with the kids. He brought me flowers. People were jealous of me. Everybody wanted to be like me, you see? When he dropped me off at my friend's house, he had even missed his 5 o'clock prayer. And getting out of the car, he had a face so serious, so sad, when I said, 'It's okay, Alioune, I wish you lots of luck with the other.' He had such a sad face, and it was that day that I knew he was still quite attached to me. After he told me, I looked in his cell phone, and I saw 2 women's names. I thought, between one of these 2 names, one of them is her. He had gone to the mosque at Fajr in the morning, and as soon as he left the house, I took his cell phone. I looked and I saw a message that said, 'Chérie, what time are you coming home?' It was like someone threw cold water on me. I waited for him at the edge of the bed. He came back from the mosque, as always, in the morning. 'Assalamu alaikum,' I said. 'Wa alaikum salam.' And I looked him straight in the eyes. I didn't know if he had already married the woman or what. He shrieked, 'What? Why are you looking at me like that?' I gave him his cell phone. He looked like he had the shock of his life. He didn't understand because it was his microchip from Paris. He didn't think the messages would show up here. That was the hand of God. After he understood, he said, 'I wasn't going to talk to you about this now, but since you're digging around in my stuff, sit down and I'm going to talk with you.' I said, 'Wait, I'm going to pray.' He insisted, and I said I was praying. I did my ablution slowly, like it was my life's work. After, he said, 'I took a second wife, but not here, in Paris.' I told him, 'May God grant you a wonderful marriage together. May God grant you long lives together. May God grant you many children.' He couldn't stand it. He said, 'Ay, vas-y, vas-y, vas-y.' Then I took my Quran, I went to the living room, and I started to read. I said to myself, 'You heard him. You no longer have the right to cause trouble. You have a co-wife now.' That day he dropped me off at the market. I cooked him the best chebujen I have ever made in my life. So good that he ate and ate and ate. I didn't leave the kitchen during this time. You should have seen me. I had all these European recipes. I didn't get bored that month, and he was really uneasy. He thought I would take my stuff and go to my mother's. When you take a second wife, you're supposed to give a big gift to your first wife, but instead it was me who ran after him. But I had a delayed reaction, you know, like when you lose someone you love. But when he told me he was going back to France, I told him I would tear up his passport. And I did. I wanted to show him that I could be a player too. So I waited until he leisurely left his computer bag. He'd gone to the mosque. I looked in his bag, and there I saw a receipt for a fancy hotel, Monsieur Alioune Tal and Madame Ta-Ta-Ta, and I ripped that up. I threw it in the middle of the bed. Next, I looked at the passport. I didn't want to rip up the whole passport. It wasn't worth the effort. So I looked at the page that said Visa, French Embassy, 1 year, and I ripped that page up. I had to do it because I didn't want him to lead this life, especially with that woman in Paris waiting for him with the tasty dishes she'd made, working so hard. What she made there, she was going to eat herself. When he came back from the mosque, he said, "Wow, the floor is just covered with stuff." And then he saw. He said, "Get your bags together, you are going to your parents." I said to him, "No, I am not leaving your house, not without my kids. You didn't marry me like some vulgar dish rag, not without my kids." He called my dad, saying all this stuff about what I did. But what could my dad do? Nothing. Ultimately, Binta's anger has become sadness. She lives alone in a large, luxurious house with her 3 children, and her husband rarely visits. She says she is contemplating divorce. As I was leaving, she showed me a purse her co-wife had sent her from France. It had 2 hearts hanging from the zipper. With a sad look in her eyes, Binta said, "My co-wife said the 2 hearts stand for me and my husband. She really is a nice person." In relating Aida's, Hawa's, and Binta's un-Sunnite-like behavior, I do not mean to imply that they have committed breaches that signify the ultimate failure of the Sunnites' patriarchal project. My respondents remain firmly committed to the movement's norms of male dominance and female submission. I am suggesting, however, that these spaces of psychological resistance, these emotional transgressions, may never be resolved for some Sunnite women, perhaps particularly those who are highly educated and successful in their careers. These emotions may just not be retrainable. In her analysis of middle-aged South Korean evangelical women, Kelly Chong focuses particularly on those who experienced psychological traumas in their marriages as a result of the discrepancy between raised expectations for personal autonomy and romantic love and their mothers-in-law and husbands' oppressive behaviors. Chong problematizes the agency of acceptance by pointing out that many women's intellectual resistance to their church's requirements for feminine submission in the home and in worship. However, these Korean women came to terms with a patriarchal bargain where they ultimately acquiesced to the church's expectations in return for the spiritual comfort provided by social networks, belief, and their sometimes conciliatory husbands. It is unclear to me whether my long-term Sunnite respondents, many of whom married a decade ago, will ultimately reconcile their disappointments in their marriages with their faith's perspective on polygamy. Divorce is a reasonably available option for women in Dakar when they are unhappy in their marriages. In fact, Fatou Dial, the author of a new book, Mariage et Divorce à Dakar, lists polygamy as a popular reason for divorce. Yet so far, none of my Sunni respondents have divorced because of co-wives, and of those that have divorced, most have re-entered polygamous unions. Is it possible that Sunnite discourses on gracious co-wives are powerful enough to provide a disincentive to divorce, but not strong enough to muffle female adherents' anger and heartbreak when their own husband marries another wife? I have seen my respondents articulate hurt for their marriages and instead find happiness in their identities as professionals, mothers, and pious women. Perhaps they have taken any future possibility for romantic love out of the question, or perhaps their emotional resistance to men's choices will simply remain as a transgression of the Sunnites' gender project. If this is the case, we might be able to talk about a new form of agency and subjectivation for Islamist women, one in which the subject is formed by a variety of conflicting social norms in a volatile, changing society, and who has the agentive capacity to uphold some hegemonic ideals while defying others. Love is a complicated subject wherever you go. In Western settings, in African Sunnite milieus, and in transnational immigrant families, there are expectations, hopes, happinesses, and hurts in marriage. I have had the chance to get to know many West African immigrants in my decade of work as an English teacher at African Services Committee in Harlem, New York. Senegalese Muslim women who have been in some way affected by the mass exodus of African youth to economically better off places in the world, which include Togo, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, China, Europe, and the US, often experience the difficulties of long-distance love, or at the very least, long-distance marriage. I'd like to quickly introduce a few examples that Senegalese in New York's immigrant community have shared with me about their lives. While I haven't conducted any formal study, their experiences raise interesting questions that I'd like to learn more about. My first example is from my conversations with Suleiman, who currently lives in Harlem but manages a clothing store owned by two Arabic-speaking Israeli men in Queens. He is married to his cousin Safi, who is about half his age and who was promised in marriage to him when they were both children. She lives in a village near Kaolack, Senegal, and was married to Suleiman at 17 years old, but she hasn't seen him since she was 9. Suleiman had, by the time Safi had turned 10, emigrated to work in the Ivory Coast and then the United States. Suleiman easily supports Safi. He earns $800 a week, and he has built a home for his family, for Safi's family, and an apartment building in Dakar. But Suleiman has no papers, and he has not been to Senegal in 20 years because if he left the United States, he would not be able to return. His parents and one brother have died without him being able to say goodbye, and he has never consummated his marriage to Safi. Page after page of his photo albums display one photo of himself, pasted lovingly next to a glamour photo Safi has sent him, dressed up in the clothes he has paid for or even sent from the United States. His sexual liaisons with girlfriends in the United States are a source of embarrassment and hurt for him that he hides from his family, and he fights frequently over the telephone with Safi's older brother, who threatens to divorce Safi from him unless he manages to find a way to bring Safi to the US, which is actually next to impossible because he is undocumented. I have gotten to know Safi during my trips to Senegal, and she insists that she will stay married to Suleiman because she loves him. I'd like to restate here that it is not out of prurient interest or any ethnocentric critique of the structure of Muslim families that I raise these anecdotes about the experience of immigration and marriage for some Senegalese women. While I haven't started any formal study on the immigrants here in Harlem, my observations have led me to consider questions that I hope to examine in future research and that might be of interest to anyone addressing African Muslim women's migration experiences. Some queries that come to mind are, which psychological and discursive spaces does the migratory process open in familial negotiations for African Muslim women? What, for instance, do women like Safi gain from marriage to men they never see? Does Suleiman's financial support offer Safi financial and social capital through her abilities to redistribute earnings? And does this balance out the difference of family feuds, not living with her husband, the possible existence of unrequited sexual desire, and the unlikelihood of bearing one's own children? What are the cultural and psychic ways women keep their marriages vibrant in their imaginations, in imaginings by friends and family, and in their own husband's mind? What are the ways women make a difficult or painful situation bearable or even good? And what of the nature of love? Is love conceived of differently by traditional women in village settings versus women in Dakar? Is it about children and family and not about heterosexual romance? Or is the argument that romantic love is only the domain of the educated and westernized an assumption born of scholars and other elites' removal from intimate spaces in village settings? I guess I'm full of questions. The one thing I do know is that there is a lot I don't know. While books like Djal's Marriage and Divorce in Dakar and Cole and Thomas's Love in Africa are two excellent sources for approaching questions of heterosexual intimacy in African marriages, there is still much for scholars to understand. I believe that research on love and sex in any setting, but particularly in religiously conservative communities like the Sunnite community, requires long-term qualitative research with close relationships of trust between researcher and respondents. Yet even then, there are challenges. Though I strongly believe that preliminary knowledge is better than no knowledge, even my own close work with 12 Sunnite women over the last decade is in part mitigated by my identity as a Westerner. Knowledge about African women, love, and marriage, then, will benefit from sustained investigations and, equally important, comparative work shared between Western and African researchers. I hope my questions can contribute to this collective endeavor, as knowledge about African women's efficacy and happiness within transnational family units is key to supporting their multiple roles in our ever volatile and globalizing world. Thank you. Okay, so
I can stand up. Oops. Okay.
Okay, next we have Ousseina Alidou.
Thank you.
Who's going to speak on Muslim women educational leadership in Africa. Before we move to Ousseina's presentation, I just want to recognize a few people who are here with us, colleagues and friends, starting with Dr. Harold Scott, who is the director of the center here. He was quite gracious and always very, very helpful in providing the space for us here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Harold. We also have, I mean, there are many of my colleagues here from African Studies, but I'm okay. I'll introduce them. We have Dr. Vaughn, who is with us here from School of Education. Dr. Jones from the College of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you.
And I see my good friend Dr. Sandra Shannon, who's here also from the Department of English. And I know I'll introduce them as we go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you, Sister Erin, for a great presentation. I would like to thank Professor Mbaicham, Professor Wisted, and Professor Suleiman, and all the wonderful colleagues and students and the community who are hosting us. I'm really very grateful to each one of you. So, is it okay with? Okay, I will try. I would like to engage you about a little bit about my humble contribution with regard to the contribution of Muslim women in both West Africa and East Africa. I started my work naturally in West Africa in the Sahel because I'm from Niger, and that's where I was born, and I grew up experiencing a stream of literacy practices among women, which are not recorded, by the way, in the official writing about Muslim women in sub-Saharan Africa in general. So that was the book about Muslim women and the politics of agency. I was trying to look at really what happens to women in pre-colonial to colonial and post-colonial dispensation within the West African landscape. And then I moved to the East African side because that's part of my family too. Now women, we're talking about marriage. I'm married to a Swahili person, so coming from Sahel, as a Sahelian, I moved to Swahili land. And I'm interested in looking at what's the contribution of Muslim women within the Swahili landscape, about literacy practices, about the concept of agency, and whether the Muslim women are only consumers of knowledge, of other people's knowledge, rather than they themselves being producers of knowledge that has an impact across time, from pre-colonial time to the colonial and post-colonial, and to the 21st century, and I hope beyond. So it's important to start with the map of Africa, and I think we have to include other areas, and all this part, even though it's not in green, to say that there are Muslim women, there are Muslim people in these areas, and the diversity of Islam. Because even when we say we are Sufi or we are Sunnis, within each school of thought, Muslim women do fare differently. And I think it's very important to look at those nuances. Maybe, given the time. So in pre-colonial time, I want to look at the landscape. Generally, people are assuming if you are in the Francophone world, the civilizing mission brought us French and the Latin script. But if you look at on the record, and it's not really the case, there are indigenous literacy practices. If you are dealing with my own people, the Amazic and the Hausa, the Fulani people, there are literacy practices that predate the colonial experience, whether colonial experience with the British or colonial experience with the French. So with the Amazic people, for instance, the Tifinagh, which comes, by the way, on our jewelries and everything that we wear, the aesthetic part. Women transmit literacies to children, whether it's girls or boys. So the first experience with the letters is actually transmitted through the woman, right? So, and then from there, you have a diversity of knowledge produced through that heritage of the woman. So you look at that particular culture, when it becomes Islamized, it means that through the Islamic heritage, Arabic language and Arabic script get appropriated by Muslim people, whether it is in the Sahel or in the East African part, whether you are dealing with Swahili or Somalis and other cultures who have become Islamized. So the second level then of exposure to literacy practices is through the Arab Islamic. Then Arabic language is appropriated, Arabic script is appropriated, and there is a body of literature of Muslim women producing classical literature, classical poetry, using Arabic scripts, either to write poetry in Arabic language or to write poetry and other texts, by the way, using the modified Arabic script, which we call Ajami, which my brother Fallou will expand on it. But I'm trying to focus on women's heritage. Through that heritage, from the pre-colonial to they carry it in the colonial period. So when you look at the colonial period with the French, French colonizing mission, colonial civilizing mission is predicated upon the idea of civilizing the African through French language and Latin script. And so, which means that, I will talk about the difference between the British and the French in terms of language policy vis-a-vis education. So in the Francophone part, like Niger, where I come from, indigenous languages and indigenous scripts actually at an earlier period will become forbidden for those who were enrolled into the newly colonial introduced school. But we have to look at the ratio. The first people who become exposed to French colonial education were boys. It took at a much later stage that girls were enrolled in the French schools. I think if we read books by writers such as Mariam Abba or Nafisa Jallo and all that, they talk about, we can see the difference between their texts and the texts such as Ambiguous Adventure, where we are talking about the training through the Islamic school and the French school of the young Samba Jallo. Even though it is the aunt, the paternal aunt who opened the possibility for Samba Jallo to be exposed to French school, when you look at within that particular period in West Africa, the girls were not enrolled in the French school. So the girls continue to operate within indigenous form of knowledge and indigenous literacy practices through the use of Arabic script, or if it is a Amazigh area, through the use of Tifinagh, and use plus Arabic script and the Arabic language in producing knowledge. But that knowledge is not very often when we look at report about the Sahel. They say, oh, the women, there is a very tiny portion of women who are exposed to education. And here education gets redefined through a Eurocentric point of view, through the colonial framework, in the sense that education becomes narrowed down to education in a Latin script and education in European languages, whether it's French or English. The difference within the Sahel, if we are in northern Nigeria, for instance, or other places like northern Ghana, because British were a little bit more lenient towards the introduction of African languages as a buffer to the learning of English language, African languages fare better, and indigenous script, for instance, the colonial officer Lugard negotiated with the northern aristocracy not to affect the Islamic part, especially the Islamic women. So the development of literacy skills in Arabic and Ajami fare better within the English colonized space, whereas in the French colonized space, women were not exposed at all to European languages, and the negotiation about script was definitely, it's either French or nothing. So, but it does not mean because within the colonial period, the French did say that Ajami or Tifinagh were not valued. It means that they disappear in the landscape. What it means that rather than seeing them in the public sphere, it will get retrieved for women in the private domain. And it continued that tradition. In the post-colonial dispensation, unfortunately, the colonial legacy in terms of educational policy vis-a-vis literacy practices continue in the post-colonial dispensation with the French language. So many women, I would like to go to, please, Professor Winston.